For years, the Russian military machine has projected an image of inexorable forward pressure, a slow, grinding force that absorbs casualties, advances through attrition, and outlasts every opponent through sheer industrial weight. Moscow calculated that the winter of 2025 into 2026 would finally deliver what 3 years of brutal combat had failed to produce: a decisive breakthrough along Ukraine's eastern front that would shatter Kiev's defensive backbone and force a capitulation on Russian terms. The Kremlin's generals believed the frozen ground, the exhausted Ukrainian brigades, and the political fatigue in Western capitals had aligned into a perfect storm of Russian advantage. However, the precise moment Vladimir Putin's forces prepared to exploit that advantage, Ukrainian commanders executed a coordinated operational response so devastating in its precision and so unexpected in its scale that the Institute for the Study of War described the resulting Russian positional collapse as one of the most significant single-week reversals in the entire course of the conflict. What you are about to learn will truly surprise you. The images you are about to see on your screens document something that the Kremlin's state media apparatus has desperately tried to erase from the public record. Geolocated footage, verified through open-source intelligence channels and cross-referenced against Ukrainian General Staff communiques, confirms what satellite imagery first revealed in late February 2026. Russian forces along multiple axes of the Donetsk and Zaporizhia fronts are not simply pausing, they are retreating. Supply columns have been struck, forward command nodes have gone silent, and the tactical picture that emerges from this evidence points not to a temporary setback, but to a structural breakdown inside the Russian operational framework itself. There are two factors, hidden beneath the headline chaos, that actually unlock this collapse, and we will explain exactly what they are. Now we descend to that first moment when it all began. On the night of February 18, 2026, Ukrainian drone operators working within the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade initiated a coordinated strike sequence along the Orikhiv corridor in the northern Zaporizhia Oblast. What made this operation qualitatively different from hundreds of previous drone engagements was not the number of aircraft deployed, which OSINT analysts later confirmed at somewhere between 60 and 80 individual platforms, but rather the targeting logic behind them. Ukrainian forces did not aim at Russian infantry positions. They did not target visible armor concentrations. They targeted the nervous system of the Russian logistics chain, specifically a fuel depot at Polohai, 2 forward ammunition transfer points near Tokmak, and, most critically, a mobile field headquarters coordinating the Russian 58th Combined Arms Army's supply routes across a 43-kilometer stretch of front line. Within 72 hours of those strikes, Ukrainian armored reconnaissance units reported Russian vehicle movements consistent not with offensive staging but with retrograde repositioning. The retreat had begun. But the truly chilling detail is not that Russia pulled back. The chilling detail is what the retreat exposed behind it, and we will return to that shortly. To understand why these strikes landed with such catastrophic effect, it is necessary to examine the specific technical architecture that Ukrainian forces have spent the preceding 18 months assembling. The MTTC assessment framework, which evaluates mission success against factors of mission, enemy, terrain, troops, and civilian considerations, reveals a Ukrainian operational design of remarkable sophistication. The drones used in the February 18th strike sequence were not the commercially modified quadcopters that defined early war tactics. They were fiber optic guided FPV platforms, a technology that the Ukrainian defense industry, with technical assistance from Baltic partners, had scaled to meaningful battlefield density by late 2025. Unlike radio frequency-guided drones, which can be disrupted by Russian Krasuka and Pol-21 electronic warfare systems, fiber optic guidance cannot be jammed. The signal travels through a physical cable, immune to the electromagnetic countermeasures that Russia has spent billions deploying across its forward defensive zones. Russian electronic warfare operators positioned at stations in Melitopol and Berdyansk could watch the drones approach on their screens and had absolutely no mechanism to interrupt their flight paths. The psychological impact on Russian personnel encountered in prisoner of war debriefs, reviewed by Ukrainian intelligence and referenced in a CSIS analysis from early March 2026, has been described as profound. Soldiers who had learned to take comfort from the hum of jamming equipment discovered overnight that the comfort was illusory. The second technical factor compounding this crisis was the introduction of upgraded ATACMS Block 2A munitions, whose extended operational parameters allowed Ukrainian strike cells to reach logistics nodes previously considered safe at depths of up to 190 kilometers behind the contact line. 2 rail transfer hubs near Nova Kakhovka, which had been functioning as the primary resupply arteries for Russian forces across the southern axis, were struck in coordinated strikes on February 20th and February 21st, destroying an estimated 340 tons of artillery ammunition and collapsing the delivery schedule for 3 Russian combined arms divisions simultaneously. Moscow had no contingency for this, but this is not the most shocking detail. We will explain what Russia actually lost in the next phase of this analysis, because the ammunition is almost secondary to something far more significant. When tactical success cascades into operational collapse, the chain of consequences becomes self-reinforcing in ways that military planners describe as catastrophic compounding. The loss of the Tokmak forward headquarters did not simply disrupt communications, it severed the real-time targeting coordination that Russian artillery batteries depend upon for their suppression missions. Without that coordination, the Russian 136th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade and elements of the 7th Guards Mountain Combined Arms Army, which had been staged for a renewed push toward Hulyapol, found themselves in a fire support vacuum. Ukrainian artillery units, equipped with M109A7 Paladin self-propelled howitzers and repositioned Caesar-wheeled artillery platforms, immediately recognized the signature of a suppression gap and began firing counter-battery missions that the Institute for the Study of War confirmed destroyed or mission-killed 14 Russian self-propelled gun systems within a 48-hour window. The operational arithmetic is stark. 14 fewer artillery systems in that sector represents a reduction of approximately 1,400 rounds per day of Russian fire capacity, which in the doctrinal language of combined arms warfare translates to an inability to suppress Ukrainian infantry movement across roughly 18 kilometers of front line. Ukrainian infantry commanders recognized this opening. Within 4 days of the initial drone strikes, elements of the 12th Special Forces Brigade and the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade had advanced an average of 4 to 6 kilometers along 3 separate axes in the northern Zaporizhzhia Oblast, reclaiming territory that had cost Russia months of costly offensive pressure to secure. The map, which had barely moved in 6 months, began to move again. And then something happened that no one in Moscow expected, which we will explain in detail because it changes everything about how this war is now being fought. The geopolitical reverberations of what happened in Zaporizhzhia Oblast in late February 2026 extend far beyond the immediate front lines, touching the foundations of the entire architecture that Vladimir Putin has constructed to sustain his war economy and maintain the fiction of invincibility for domestic consumption. Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, released a classified assessment, the summary of which was later reported by Der Spiegel on March 4, 2026, concluding that Russian ground forces have now suffered cumulative equipment losses exceeding 9,400 armored vehicles since the invasion began, a figure that strains the reconstitution capacity of Russia's defense industrial base, even accounting for the increased production rates achieved since the wartime economic mobilization of 2023. Russia's tank production, which Russian state media has celebrated as proof of industrial resilience, stands at approximately 1,400 units per year under optimized wartime conditions according to CSIS analysis. The problem is that the frontline attrition rate, now accelerated by fiber-optic FPV strikes and precision deep fires, is consuming equipment faster than factories in Nizhny Tagil and Omsk can replace it. The parallel that historians will draw is not comfortable for the Kremlin. In the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, Finland bled the Soviet military machine far beyond what any rational assessment of relative power would have predicted, not through equivalent strength but through superior tactical ingenuity applied against an opponent whose systemic rigidity prevented adaptive response. Ukraine in 2026 is demonstrating a comparable dynamic, but with one critical difference. Finland fought alone. Ukraine fights with the industrial and financial backing of a 32-nation NATO alliance, augmented by the security cooperation frameworks of Australia, Japan, and South Korea, the latter having quietly transferred 300 additional K2 Black Panther main battle tanks to Ukraine between November 2025 and February 2026 under a bilateral security agreement that bypassed traditional export restriction mechanisms. Russia cannot match this network. And the sanctions architecture that has been tightened 3 consecutive times since 2022, most recently in January 2026 when the European Union's 14th sanctions package closed critical microelectronics loopholes, is strangling the precision component supply chains that Russian defense manufacturers depend upon for advanced munitions. Putin's war machine is running, but it is running on borrowed time. Now we descend to the human dimension of what these numbers actually mean on the ground. In the debriefs of Russian prisoners of war captured during the Zaporizhzhia retrograde, Ukrainian intelligence officers have recorded testimonies that paint a portrait of a force in psychological crisis that no official Russian military communique will ever acknowledge. One account, summarized in a Ukrainian parliamentary committee briefing reviewed by Radio Free Europe in early March 2026, described a conscript from Buryatia, drafted in the autumn of 2025 mobilization wave, who had received 11 days of training before deployment to the contact line. He had never fired the anti-tank guided missile system he was assigned to operate. His unit had received no winter uniform resupply since December. When the fiber-optic drones began striking the positions around him without warning, he described watching his platoon commander's face transform from authority to bewilderment, the expression of a man whose understanding of the technological battlefield had been rendered completely obsolete. This is not an isolated story, it is a systemic portrait. The Russian military's reliance on mass mobilization to compensate for professional losses has created a force with critical skill gaps at precisely the tactical level where modern drone warfare demands the highest individual competence. Meanwhile, Ukrainian personnel, while also exhausted after years of combat, have undergone continuous rotational training programs in Poland, the United Kingdom, and Germany, producing a cadre of NCOs and junior officers with combat experience married to Western tactical doctrine. The asymmetry is not merely material, it is cognitive. Russian forces in late February 2026 were not simply outgunned, they were outthought. And Vladimir Putin, sitting in the gilded chambers of the Kremlin, watching casualty reports that his inner circle has been systematically softening before delivery, may be operating on a strategic picture that bears only marginal relationship to the brutal operational reality unfolding in the mud and frost of Zaporizhzhia. The gap between his perception and ground truth is not a minor analytical error. It is the kind of catastrophic intelligence failure that history records at the precise moment before empires begin to fracture. The question that now preoccupies every serious analyst at institutions from the Rand Corporation to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute is not whether Russia has suffered a setback. The evidence makes that question obsolete, but rather what the trajectory of this setback means for the next 3 to 6 months of the conflict and, by extension, for the broader architecture of European and global security. The most cautious assessment, grounded in the current rate of Ukrainian territorial reclamation and Russian force reconstitution data, suggests that Moscow faces a compounding operational dilemma with no clean resolution. If Russia commits its reserve formations, primarily elements of the 4th Guards Tank Division currently positioned in Rostov Oblast, to stabilize the Zaporizhzhia line, it depletes the strategic reserve that Putin has been husbanding for a potential renewed offensive toward Kharkiv in the late spring. If Russia holds that reserve and accepts the current retrograde, it risks a further territorial erosion that could expose the administrative structures Russia has attempted to construct in occupied Zaporizhzhia Oblast to direct Ukrainian pressure. There is no good option. Only time will tell which calculation Moscow makes. But there is a third possibility that Western intelligence agencies appear to be actively monitoring, and it is perhaps the most consequential of all, that the Russian political military establishment, confronted with the accelerating evidence of its own strategic failure, begins to fracture internally in ways that even Vladimir Putin cannot control. The FSB's internal reporting on domestic sentiment, leaked fragments of which appeared in the independent Russian outlet Meduza in late February 2026, indicate that elite opinion in Moscow is undergoing a quiet but unmistakable shift. The war that was supposed to demonstrate Russian greatness has instead become a relentless daily accounting of Russian weakness. And in political systems built on the mythology of strength, the moment that mythology becomes impossible to sustain is not a gradual decline. It is a sudden collapse. The question of whether the Russian Federation can hold itself together through what may be coming is one that the coming months may begin to answer in ways that will reshape this entire region for a generation. What has unfolded in Zaporizhzhia Oblast between February 18th and the final days of February 2026 is not simply a tactical setback for Russian arms. It is the clearest picture yet of the fundamental untenability of Vladimir Putin's strategic position, a position built on the assumption that industrial mass, geographic depth, and Western political fatigue would ultimately prevail over Ukrainian determination and Western technological superiority. That assumption has not merely been challenged, it has been dismantled, systematically and publicly, in the very theater where Russia most needed to demonstrate dominance. The frozen ground of southern Ukraine in the winter of 2026 has not betrayed Ukraine as Moscow calculated. It has betrayed Russia. What do you think? Can Putin reverse this trajectory before the spring thaw changes the conditions of battle once more? Or has the momentum of this war fundamentally shifted beyond his ability to reclaim? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video for more analysis of the critical developments that mainstream coverage consistently misses. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.